Now, lots of stuff going on in commodity markets. So we're happy to welcome him to talk to us about that. Just a little bit of housekeeping. So we are going to have a Q&A after the presentation. So you'll notice the mic in the middle of the room. So if you want to ask a question, you can please go to the mic and ask your question. And so I think we've got time for about 15 minutes after the formal presentation. So I'd like to welcome Larry to the stage, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Catherine, for the very kind introduction and for the invitation to speak today. It's a pleasure to be here. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here in Edmonton on a beautiful sunny day. I'm going to be talking about commodity prices, how important they are. Not only their commodities including oil and their prices, and how important they are to the Alberta and Canadian economies, but also the relationship between commodity prices and the Canadian dollar. See the exchange rate as the most important price facing our economy because it affects much of what we produce, consume, and trade. That's why this is the right place to examine the critical role our flexible exchange rate plays in Canada's economy. And the time is right as well. Canada has just entered its 50th consecutive year with a floating currency, the longest of any country. We are also in the midst of our Toward 2021 campaign of public engagement. And this is my second speech in this campaign to engage the public in our renewal of our inflation target. We call it the Toward 2021 campaign because 2021 is the next renewal date for our 5-year inflation control agreement with the federal government, which was first adopted in 1991. For this renewal, we've committed to conducting a comprehensive review of our monetary policy framework to ensure it best achieves our mandated goal of price stability and thereby promotes strong and sustainable output and employment growth for the benefit of all Canadians. As part of this, of our campaign, we are reaching out to a wide range of private sector stakeholders and interested Canadians to collect their views on our monetary policy framework. So our monetary policy framework consists of two important components. One is the inflation target, a 2% inflation target within a 3% target range, and our flexible exchange rate. Now, this specification of the target has been in place since 1995. Now, the inflation target normally gets most of the attention. So the value of our floating dollar risks being overlooked at a time when the performance of flexible exchange rates is coming under greater scrutiny in international policy circles. My purpose today is to review the evidence and make the case that Canada and many other open economies have been well served by a market-determined flexible exchange rate. In particular, Canada's experience with inflation targeting, underpinned by a floating currency, is an instructive example of the most durable monetary policy framework in the post-war period. The flexible exchange rate has helped our economy adjust to external shocks, primarily changes in commodity prices, and I'll talk about that a lot this afternoon. While our floating currency does not completely offset the impact of all these shocks, it has complemented the bank's inflation target to help achieve low and stable inflation and keep our economy functioning well. We're not going to alter the flexible exchange rate component of our monetary policy framework, but it's incumbent on policymakers to review even successful regimes on a regular basis to ensure that they are still serving the best interests of Canadians. So let's review the four main benefits of our floating dollar. First, it gives domestic monetary policy sufficient independence to achieve price stability. Second, it facilitates adjustment to external shocks, therefore buffering their impact on economic activity. Third, it contributes to policy clarity and effectiveness. And fourth, it promotes financial sector development. I'll also discuss some recent criticisms of flexible exchange rates. Now, because flexible exchange rates are market prices that are traded daily, they are intrinsically volatile. This volatility increases the cost of making international transactions and posing risks that have to be managed, especially by exporters and importers. Nonetheless, we come down squarely on the side that the benefits of a flexible exchange rate far exceed the costs. For understanding these benefits and costs, the Canadian context is very important. Oops. It's not moving. Oh, there we go, sorry. The production export commodities play an important role in the Canadian economy. Their prices are primarily determined by global forces of demand and supply. Most of Canada's key commodity exports are also priced in US dollars, a point I will come back to later. Canada's flexible exchange rate is also determined by market forces, though the Bank of Canada clearly has some influence on it through our policy interest rate. When we raise interest rates or raise expectations of higher interest rates, the loonie tends to appreciate against other currencies and vice versa. In this way, the dollar is an important channel for the transmission of monetary policy. But as important as the currency's value is to exports, imports in the overall economy, the bank does not have a specific target for the dollar. The flexible exchange rate works best when it is determined by market conditions within a credible policy framework. Consequently, we haven't intervened in the currency markets on our own behalf in more than 20 years. Because commodities are an important share of our exports, their prices influence the value of our exchange rate. Oh, here we go, okay. Throughout our history, Canada's economic prosperity has been based on the export of commodities. This chart shows the share of commodity-based exports and share in total exports. And you can see that since 1980, it's varied over time, never below a third of total exports. And most recently, it's about 45% of total exports. And the types of commodities we export has also varied over time. This chart shows the export shares of oil and gas in red, forestry and wood products in blue, actually metals and minerals in blue, wood and forestry products in green, agricultural food products in yellow, and other goods in purple, and those are primarily chemicals, plastic, and rubber products. These shares have varied over time, with the oil and gas, as you can see in the red bars, increasing its share of total exports, total commodity exports over the 2000s, and the share of wood and forestry products declining over roughly the same period. Given the importance of commodities, especially most recently oil in our consumption in our export basket, how do the prices influence the exchange rate and the conduct of monetary policy? To answer that question, let me describe the monetary policy framework in action. Our main monetary policy objective is price stability. Maintaining low and stable inflation around 2% provides a credible nominal anchor for our economy. Now, the policy interest rate is controlled by the Bank of Canada and is primarily influenced by our outlook for economic activity and inflation, with the aim of achieving our inflation target. In contrast, the exchange rate is determined by global market forces, both real and financial. And our research at the bank indicates that the key determinants of the exchange rate are commodity prices and the US-Canada interest rate differential. Because our flexible exchange rate responds to and helps absorb these external forces, it allows us to target inflation with the policy rate with much success. Since the introduction of inflation targeting, the value of the loonie has ranged from a low of about 62 US cents to above parity, while inflation has remained within the 1% to 3% range for more than 80% of the time. Now, that price stability has come despite the financial crises of the 1990s in emerging market economies, the strong expansion globally at the turn of the millennium, the global financial crisis in 2007, 2008, the Great Recession that followed it, and the subsequent slow recovery after that. These events often generated large fluctuations in commodity prices. Our monetary policy framework is supported by several critical advantages we have as a nation, including sustainable fiscal policy and a strong financial policy framework. Given this context, let's turn to the 4 benefits of our flexible exchange rate. The first benefit of our floating currency is the ability to steer our own course for monetary policy and inflation. Throughout our history, Canada has relied on foreign trade and investment for our economic prosperity. But this openness also leaves Canadians vulnerable to events in the rest of the world. So the best strategy to reduce this vulnerability is to keep our own house in good order, including having a monetary policy aimed at low and stable inflation. So how does a flexible exchange rate give us the leeway to set our own course for monetary policy and inflation? Let me go back in history. So Canada first abandoned the post-war Bretton Woods pegged exchange rate system in 1950. Now, this decision was widely criticized at the time, but has proven to be a trailblazing policy shift. It demonstrated the value of a flexible exchange rate, likely sparing Canadians several years of double-digit inflation in the 1950s. At the time, the U.S. economy was growing strongly, fueled by military spending for the Korean War, and commodity prices were rising. Canadian authorities decided to allow their exchange rate to float, in other words, to be determined by market forces. The Canadian dollar appreciated rapidly, helping to stem the inflationary pressure. So let's see what happened. So let's consider what happened to inflation in Canada when it let its currency float vis-a-vis compared to Mexico, which maintained its peg to the US dollar and was exposed to the same influences. You can see the chart that inflation rate in Mexico, which is the blue line, was much higher than that of Canada for most of the 1950s. And so Canada's in red and Mexico in blue. So the fact that we were able to allow our currency to float, that inflationary pressure that was coming from the United States was mitigated, whereas in Mexico, which maintained its peg to the US dollar, absorbed a lot of that inflationary pressure, and so its citizens had to withstand double-digit inflation for most of the 1950s. Canada returned to a pegged rate for the period from 1962 to 1970, but left the Bretton Woods system for good in 1970. And the circumstances for the departure were similar to those in 1950. If one replaces the Korean War with the Vietnam War, you can see what happened on the chart in the right. Again, Canada decided to float its exchange rate, and Mexico maintained the peg, and you can see that inflation increased fairly dramatically in Mexico, well above what we were experiencing in Canada. Now, Canada adopted its current monetary policy framework in 1991, and it was successful in lowering inflation and making it more stable. This experience was shared by other early adopters of inflation targeting, for example, New Zealand in 1990 and Sweden in 1993. Since then, some 40 countries in total have been able to successfully chart an independent course for monetary policy and exert domestic control over inflation by adopting a flexible exchange rate and an inflation target. And yet today, some are questioning the value of the flexible exchange rate. They argue that domestic financial conditions are largely determined by global forces, regardless of the exchange rate regime in place. They say renders domestic monetary policy ineffective. To increase monetary policy control, they recommend using controls on capital flows, particularly in emerging market economies. Imposing capital controls, however, would distort incentives and likely hinder financial sector development. In summary, for commodity exporters like Canada, the need to chart a course for domestic monetary policy independent of that in the United States typically arises when there are large swings in commodity prices. Because the United States is a net commodity importer, such movements have a large differential impact on our two countries. That means in order to maintain price stability, a different monetary policy in Canada is essential. So let's consider the second benefit of our flexible exchange rate, in that it helps the domestic economy adjust to external shocks. With a global shock, such as the recent trade conflict, commodity prices are hit first. They are the bellwether. In this chart, the blue line shows commodity prices responding to important global developments. For example, the entry of China into the WTO and the global economy more broadly sparked a run-up in the demand for commodities and their prices from 2002 to 2007. The opposite occurred during the Great Recession of 2008-2009. In both cases, look how closely the red line, which is the exchange rate, our exchange rate moved in lockstep with the index of commodity prices. But how does the flexible exchange rate actually smooth economic adjustment to a commodity price shock? Let's analyze a recent example in more depth that I'm sure most of you are familiar with. During the oil price shock of 2014-2015, the price of West Texas Intermediate WTI declined from about $100 a barrel US in 2014 to $34 a barrel in 2016. Over the same period, the Canadian dollar fell from 92 cents to 73 cents US. So let's do a counterfactual exercise to see what might have happened without the depreciation. Suppose we had attempted to hold the Canadian dollar steady even as our key export commodity was dropping in value. It wouldn't have been easy in many different ways, in more ways than one, as we'll show in a moment. The obvious way to limit the fall of the dollar would have been for the bank to raise interest rates. We estimate that would have required us to increase the policy rate to 7% by early 2016. In fact, as you may recall, we actually cut our policy rate twice in 2015 by 25 basis points each time to 0.5%. These hypothetical increases would have had tremendous adverse effects on our economy. If you look at the chart, the impact on GDP, for example, the red line, would have been down by $60 billion, or 3.1% by early 2016. Hours worked, the blue line, would have been down by 4.7% relative to what we actually observed. And that translates into 900,000 fewer jobs. The unemployment rate would have been up to 4 percentage points higher. And nominal wages would have been 2.5% lower. And if you look at the chart, the green line is inflation. Inflation would have been down by about 1% relative to what we actually observed. So as you can see, under a pegged exchange rate, the adjustment is very painful. Wages and prices must adjust, and most of the burden is borne by workers. So in reality, how did the 20% depreciation facilitate adjustment? Because the dollar declined less than the price of oil, the relative price of other goods and services rose compared to oil. This relative price change provided a strong signal to firms to allocate people and capital away from the oil sector towards other sectors of our economy. Foreign goods and services also became more expensive, and that caused Canadian firms and households to switch their spending away from foreign goods and services towards domestically produced items. So the flexible exchange rate doesn't absorb the commodity price shock as much as it helps to smooth the adjustment in relative prices. Now, in Alberta, you've seen both sides of this. When oil prices rose between 2002 and 2008, the Canadian dollar soared alongside to reach parity with the US dollar. Ontario's manufacturing sector lost international competitiveness as its goods became more expensive overseas, and investment and workers flowed into the energy sector in Alberta and Saskatchewan. Of course, the flow reversed in 2014 as oil prices fell and the dollar depreciated. Alberta's economy ebbed while other regions expanded, and the Canadian economy was forced to adjust. Now, some economists have argued that this smoother adjustment provided by a flexible exchange rate is less than advertised, in part because the US dollar has become the dominant currency in pricing many goods that are traded. Therefore, exchange rate movements may not affect the relative price of imports and exports. However, the evidence for Canada does not support this argument. Even though 80% of our imports and more than 90% of our exports are priced in US dollars, exchange rate movements still play a critical role in helping our economy adjust to large commodity price shocks. The third benefit of a floating exchange rate is that it helps clarify and enhance the respective roles of monetary policy and the exchange rate. Before the adoption of our inflation target, the goal of monetary policy was unclear. Market participants at that time often believed that the Bank of Canada placed some weight on stabilizing the exchange rate. With the adoption of inflation targeting, the primary goal of monetary policy became much clearer: low and stable inflation. The role of the exchange rate became sharper also, specifically responding to external shocks and in particular commodity price movements, as we've argued. Compelling evidence of this clarification of roles comes from recent research conducted at the bank. Before 1991, the policy rate responded to movements in both the exchange rate and the U.S. federal funds rate, in addition to economic conditions. Since 1992, however, the reaction of our policy rate to the interest rate has essentially disappeared. Simply put, inflation targeting allowed the bank to focus its monetary policy almost exclusively on the goal of price stability. This finding is corroborated by evidence that shows that the exchange rate became much more sensitive to commodity price movements after the adoption of inflation targeting. And this delineation of roles occurred in other countries as well. For example, let's examine what happened to Australia on the left and Chile on the right. And the vertical line shows when the two countries adopted inflation targeting and a flexible exchange rate. And you can see that after the adoption of inflation targeting, the correlation between the exchange rate and the commodity price index in both countries increased. This suggests that as the roles of monetary policy and the exchange rate became clearer, both became more effective. As a consequence, when we see this chart for Canada, our monetary policy framework was very effective in achieving price stability. So in the chart we have the inflation in blue, and you can see before the adoption of inflation targeting, inflation was relatively high and varied, but after we put in place the inflation targeting regime, inflation became much lower and more stable. At the same time, the flexible exchange rate in red helped facilitate adjustment to commodity price movements and other global shocks. The fourth benefit of a flexible exchange rate is that it has helped promote financial development in Canada. Even with an independent monetary policy, sustaining strong economic growth requires a well-developed financial sector. Over our history, our financial markets and institutions have developed to support the free flow of capital and trade in our country. The financial deepening enhanced the transmission of monetary policy and improved the functioning of our flexible exchange rate. Moreover, our financial system has evolved to provide safe and efficient intermediation of foreign capital flows. When the Canadian dollar was floated in the past, financial markets in Canada came into being not only to trade currencies, but also to help manage the risk associated with the floating dollar. These markets were relatively thin in the 1970s and 1980s, and the bank had to intervene on an ongoing basis to provide liquidity and reduce volatility in these markets. However, by the 1990s, this intervention ended as markets had become much deeper and more liquid. These markets allow Canadian firms to manage exchange rate risk and other risks associated with international transactions at low cost. In other words, markets became more complete. Now, this lesson is not unique to Canada. Many other countries, especially in Latin America, have had similar experiences. So let me conclude. Canada's long-standing commitment to a flexible exchange rate has served us well. It has contributed to low and stable inflation and strong and sustainable output and employment growth. The flexible exchange rate supports and enhances the effectiveness of independent monetary policy. And it helps the economy adjust to external shocks, primarily significant fluctuations in commodity prices that we've experienced in the past. As I've mentioned, we are conducting a formal review of our monetary policy framework leading up to the 2020 renewal of our inflation control agreement with the federal government. As part of this review, we are engaging with a wide range of stakeholders and interested Canadians. Allow me to say a few words in French. La cible de l'inflation retient surtout l'attention, mais le taux de change flottant est une partie essentielle de notre cadre et de son succès. Le Canada a fonctionné avec un taux de change flottant, largement déterminé par le marché, pendant la plupart des 70 années. C'est plus que tous les autres pays. To repeat that in English, while the inflation target gets most of the attention, our flexible exchange rate is a critical component of the framework and necessary for its success. We have operated with a market-determined flexible exchange rate for most of the last 70 years, by far the longest of any country. At the same time, we know that the components that have contributed to the success of the Canada's system are not in place everywhere. Emerging market economies may need more time to develop well-functioning financial markets and institutions and to achieve sufficient policy credibility to realize the benefits of a floating exchange rate. But Canada's experience is no longer the exception. Many other countries have learned from our performance. They have realized many of the same benefits I described today by adopting a framework anchored on a flexible exchange rate and inflation target. Just as the gold standard was once accepted as the orthodoxy, this monetary policy framework has proven to be the most durable monetary policy standard in the post-war period. None of the 40 countries or so that have credibly adopted this framework have subsequently abandoned it. It has stood the test of time. Merci pour votre attention. Thank you for your attention.
So maybe I'll ask the first question here.
Sure.
So back at the front, or we had a bit of talk at the table here, and you were talking about growth in services in Canada and how that's becoming a larger driver. So how does the bank view sort of some of the challenges that we have in capturing, for example, pricing of services, trade and services, and how that plays into sort of how you approach that with your inflation target?
Well, services, it's true. Most of our statistical framework that we use in Canada is based on the production of commodities and other tangible goods. And so going to services poses some new challenges. I know that StatsCan's been working very carefully and thoroughly to try to address some of these measurement issues. For example, more recently we've had updated data on monthly trade and services, which is an innovation. But questions of for example, productive capacity, measuring some of the investment in services, for example, investment in databases, investment in other types of less tangible types of investment are challenges that not only StatsCan, but in many other jurisdictions are facing. So I think you're right, it does pose a challenge as to how we better manage the data associated with services, but also think about it in terms of the conduct of monetary policy. Thank you.
Yeah, my question has to do with the role of the bank in environmental scanning and risk management, and in particular, an important price, whether it's explicit or implicit for the Canadian economy, is the price of greenhouse gas emission permits. It's largely determined by public policy in the same way as the policy interest rate is by the Bank of Canada. So I have a couple of questions. First of all, what is the role of the Bank of Canada in assessing the impact of that price, whether it's explicit or implicit, on the risks faced by the Canadian economy going forward? And secondly, since it is a price which is determined by governmental institutions in the same way as interest rate, if we are to retain having that as a publicly determined rate, should there be an institution like the Bank of Canada that is responsible for the determination of that price and its changes over time?
Okay. Turning first to the initial part of your question with respect to how we think about the measurement of the pricing of admission permits, it does, to the extent that it flows through into the cost of other items, it would be picked up into the CPI, and so flow through into our measure of the inflation target. I mean, that's a simple explanation. I mean, it doesn't flow directly into the estimation of the CPI. It flows through the prices of other goods, and clearly the carbon tax would also be part of that assessment. So it is included in the prices of the commodities that are part of the basket for the CPI. So that's how the measurement issue is. In terms of, you talked about risks. In our recent financial system review, we did look at take into account climate change risk as a risk to the financial system. It's a slow-moving risk, but it's something that we have to consider, especially as the world and the Canadian economy transitions to one that's less dependent on carbon. That poses some risks to the financial system that have to be taken into account, and we started analyzing that in the most recent financial system review. Then there's the question about the risks associated with different climatic events, and that has potential implications for our outlook for the economy, and that's something I think we have to start thinking more about, in the sense that it will mean that whether we try to build that into our economic outlook or essentially react to them as they occur. But it's clear that there's been more, whether it's floods, wildfires, there's been more of these events recently, and the question becomes how do we take that into account in our monetary policy decisions? And so that's a question of ongoing work. The point about whether we need an institution to set prices for carbon emissions, that's sort of beyond the scope of Bank of Canada. That's a political decision, not one that we can make.
Yeah, but I'm asking you as a member of an institution that actually does set a price
right.
in a similar way, whether that institution is adaptable in public policy.
Well, I mean, the reason the central bank is independent, the way monetary policy is conducted in Canada is we have an inflation control agreement with the federal government. That agreement specifies the goal of monetary policy, which is the 2% target within a 1% to 3% range, and then it gives us, at the same time, it gives us the operational independence to conduct monetary policy to achieve that goal that's been set jointly by ourselves and the federal government. Now the question becomes, and achieving the inflation target sort of independently, the operational aspect of it takes it out of the political realm and puts it in the technical realm, which is our responsibility. Whether that's appropriate for setting carbon emission prices, I mean, I think there's some argument for that, but again, it's really a political decision, not one that we can make. Yes, please.
So I haven't looked at these numbers in the last couple of years, but if you ran a correlation between oil prices in US dollars and Canada-US exchange rate, you'd get in the very high 90s. And you showed that oil is actually not all that substantial in terms of the overall exports. I'm wondering, would you find a similar correlation with other commodity prices, or is it oil that kind of dominates and drives that exchange rate? And maybe kind of related to that would be, well, we have a single exchange rate that applies across the entire country, but we're really a very heterogeneous country. During the periods when exchange rate was up at parity, some parts of the Canadian economy were suffering. Alberta was in boom years, and it's kind of reversed here today. And I don't know if that's, I don't think the Bank of Canada can do much about that. I think you would say that's basically a fiscal issue. It's for the Government of Canada and the provinces to deal with that then?
So the first part of your question is really with respect to, in terms of when commodity price movements take place, you're right that the evidence seems to indicate that the Canadian dollar is most closely related to the price of oil. I mean, there are other commodities that play a role, but it just seems like oil prices tend to fluctuate quite a lot relative to other commodity prices. And so they seem to, I don't have a complete explanation, but seem to be the ones that are most closely correlated with the exchange rate. Now, it's not a perfect correlation. I mean, it varies from time to time. It tends to be what differentiates the Canadian economy relative to other economies. And so the exchange rate is a bilateral relative price. And so if it's something that's distinctive Canadian, in particular we're a major oil exporter, it would tend to influence the exchange rate more. And so I think that's what we tend to pick up. Other commodity prices play some role as well, but in particular non-energy commodity prices, they also influence the exchange rate. But oil prices tend to be the most closely correlated with the exchange rate, in part because it's the largest component of a commodity in our export basket, and also it tends to move a relatively large amount. On the second part, the fact that we have one country, we have one exchange rate, and commodity prices movements have different effects across Canada. That's something of our history. That's always been the case. And so we're one country, we have one monetary policy, we have one exchange rate, and so the flexible exchange rate helps facilitate that adjustment. Changing the structure to have different inflation rates, different interest rates, different exchange rates, I think is just steps away from who we are as a country. And I think we have other mechanisms to adjust within our country. We have relatively mobile labor, we have fiscal transfers, we have economic integration. All those factors help manage those sorts of adjustments that need to take place when there are commodity price shocks. But for the most part, we have one monetary policy and one exchange rate, and we have to use those as best we can, those other mechanisms, to help us adjust to external shocks.
So I have sort of a related question related to WTI and exchange rates. And this is kind of getting into the weeds a bit, but has the bank looked at how the relationship between the exchange rate and sort of the shift in the way WTI has been traded over time, the fact that it's more of a financial instrument for a lot of people than sort of the physical commodity, and if we've seen the relationship between that exchange rate change since, say, like the 90s versus 2000s versus now?
Right. We've looked at the bank, done research on the financialization of commodities, and our understanding seems to be that the financializations had an effect on the volatility of some commodity prices as opposed to the average level, that the level is eventually affected by global demand and supply, whereas some of the volatility may be driven by financial factors. That's the main conclusion of the research.
Right now, the U.S. dollar is the world's reserve currency. There is a possibility over the next couple of decades that that situation may change, and I was wondering what impact that would have on the conduct of what implications that would have for our economic future and the conduct of monetary policy in Canada.
Well, that's a big question. I mean, I guess the issue is, how does the U.S. no longer become a reserve currency? Is that because some other currency becomes more prominent? Yeah. I mean, well, I mean, that's always a possibility. In terms of how the reserve currencies move over time. I mean, if for example, the renminbi, which is at this juncture not a freely traded currency. I mean, it exists, but it's not easily convertible. And that's partly why the U.S. dollar remains the main reserve currency. If the renminbi were to become convertible and play a larger role, then clearly we'd have to think about different bilateral exchange rates as being more important for the Canadian outlook. Right now, for the most part, it's the U.S. Canadian dollar exchange rate that plays the largest role, but going forward, if the renminbi were to become convertible and Chinese trade relative to Canada were to increase, I mean, that would clearly be a factor that we would take into account.
I want to know how the Bank of Canada takes various risks into account, like trade risk, overall global inflation or deflation, in formulating price levels for Canada, because there's so many variables that come into picture. Do you, which one do you look at?
Well, all the variables that you mentioned, we do have models at the Bank of Canada. So essentially, how we set the interest rate is we do take into account some of the external variables that you mentioned and project the level of economic activity in Canada and then the implications of that level of economic activity for inflation. And so we adjust the interest rate in order to affect the level of aggregate demand in our economy, to affect the level of economic activity over the course of the horizon, and then the inflation rate. So we do take a lot of the factors that you mentioned into account in our models when we actually do our projections for setting the interest rate and to achieve our inflation target.
I think we're about ready to wrap things up. So ESNA we actually have a scholarship fund for University of Alberta students, so we're happy to make a donation.